The food would be consumed and dishes would be cleaned for use again tomorrow when new meals would be prepared following similar methods. Cooking and eating followed the same patterns each day with little variation in what was prepared or how it was consumed by families. Floors were left as they were after the last sweeping done earlier in the afternoon when dust had accumulated again from activity ongoing. The dust that had settled since then would remain until tomorrow when sweeping would resume as part of morning routines in homes and workshops. Brooms were put away in their usual places where they would remain until taken out again for the next sweeping to be done. The accumulation of dust was constant and sweeping was necessary to manage it, but the task could be paused overnight without consequence to anything important. Tomorrow the floors would be swept again in the same manner as they had been swept today and every day before. Animals were brought back to their pens and stalls as the day's work ended and evening approached with diminishing light everywhere present. Handlers removed harnesses and other equipment used during the day for work performed by animals under their care and direction. Feed and water were provided in amounts appropriate for each animal based on size and the work that had been done during the day. The animals would rest through the night and would be put to work again tomorrow when handlers returned to begin another day. The care and use of animals followed the same routine each day, with feeding and working and resting in regular cycles that repeated continuously. Children were called inside as evening approached and families prepared to gather for meals and for the night's rest ahead soon. Play ended and children returned to their homes where tasks might await them before eating or where they would simply wait for meals to be served. Voices and laughter faded from courtyards and streets as children disappeared into buildings where they lived with their families nearby. The spaces would remain quiet through the evening and night until tomorrow when children would emerge again to resume play in the same areas. The pattern of playing and being called inside repeated each day as children moved between freedom of play and responsibilities within their households regularly. Conversations between neighbors resumed slightly as people completed their work and had time to pause and exchange words with others encountered nearby. The conversations covered familiar topics and followed familiar patterns that required little effort from those participating in them at this time. Information was shared about the day's events or about plans for tomorrow when routines would resume in the usual manner expected. The exchanges were brief as people were tired from the day's work and wanted to return home for evening meals and rest. Conversations would happen again tomorrow when paths crossed and there was time to stop and talk with neighbors living close by in the same areas. Evening approached as light began to fade from the sky above the city and its surrounding areas where people lived and worked. Activity slowed as tasks were brought to stopping points where they could be resumed tomorrow without difficulty or loss of progress made. Workers moved toward their homes along routes walked every evening after the day's labor had been completed in various locations. The city transitioned from the busy activity of daylight to the quieter state of evening in the gradual way this transition always occurred. The change happened without announcement or marked moment when one state ended and another began in its place here. Tasks were left in positions where they could be taken up again when morning came and work resumed as usual. Tools were set down in the places where they were kept overnight and would remain until hands reached for them tomorrow. Materials were covered or moved to protected areas where they would not be damaged by weather or other conditions during the night. The workshops and work areas were prepared for the period of inactivity that would last until workers returned with daylight to continue their labor. Preparation for stopping was part of the routine of each day and followed the same pattern as it had followed before. Food was served to families gathered in homes after members had returned from the locations where they had spent the day working. Meals were eaten in the same manner as meals had been eaten on previous evenings without variation in how food was consumed. Conversations during eating were minimal as people were tired and focused on the food placed before them in bowls or on plates. The meals provided nourishment needed after the day's exertions and satisfied hunger that had built during hours of work performed since morning. Eating would be followed by cleaning of dishes and preparation for rest that would come when darkness settled completely over everything around them. Animals had been secured in their pens and stalls for the night and would remain there until morning when handlers returned. The animals rested or ate from feed provided earlier when they had been brought back from the day's work completed. Sounds from the animals were occasional and quiet as they settled into the familiar routine of night that followed each day of labor. The pens and stalls were dark and would remain so through the hours ahead until dawn brought light and the return of activity. Animals would be tended again tomorrow in the same manner they had been tended today and would be put to work performing the same tasks as before. Workshops stood empty and silent after workers had departed for their homes in the surrounding neighborhoods and streets nearby. The spaces held tools and materials in arrangements that would remain unchanged until morning when activity would resume in them again. Darkness filled the workshops as evening light faded and no lamps were lit in spaces not being used during these hours. The workshops would remain empty through the night and would fill again with workers and with the sounds of labor when tomorrow came. The pattern of emptying and filling repeated each day as work occurred during daylight and stopped when darkness made it difficult to continue. Markets were completely empty now, with all vendors having departed after packing their goods and closing their stalls for the day. The spaces where crowds had gathered earlier to buy and sell were quiet and dark, with no activity remaining to indicate their daytime purpose. Debris from the day's trading lay scattered on the ground and would be cleaned or would blow away before vendors returned tomorrow morning. The markets would transform again when dawn came and vendors arrived to set up their displays and begin another day of trading. The empty spaces waited for this transformation that would come with morning light, as it came every day without fail observed. Streets were quieter now, with fewer people moving through them as most had reached their destinations for the evening ahead. Those still walking moved toward homes or other places where they would spend the night in rest from the day's activities completed. The sounds of footsteps and occasional voices were all that remained of the noise that had filled these passages during daylight hours earlier. Streets would grow quieter still as evening progressed into night and people settled into their homes for sleep and rest. The passages between buildings would be walked again tomorrow by the same people moving to the same destinations for the same purposes as today. Homes filled with families gathered after the day's separation to different locations for work and other activities during daylight hours past. Lamplight glowed in windows where people remained awake for tasks or conversations before sleep came to them later in the evening. Voices from inside homes were muted and indistinct from outside, where streets were growing darker as light continued to fade from the sky. The homes would grow quiet as people prepared for sleep and extinguished lamps to conserve oil for future use when light would be needed again. Tomorrow the homes would empty as people departed for their daily activities and would fill again in the evening when they returned once more. Courtyards were empty and quiet after the activity of the day had ended and people had gone inside their homes for the evening. The open spaces shared by households were dark and would remain unused until tomorrow when people emerged to begin their daily routines again. Stones that formed the ground of courtyards cooled as evening air settled over them and the warmth from the day's sun dissipated slowly. The courtyards would be walked across again tomorrow and would be used for tasks and for gatherings that occurred during daylight when people were present. The spaces served their purpose during the day and rested and used during the night in the same pattern followed always before. Grain storage remained secured with containers sealed to protect contents from moisture and from pests that might enter during the night hours. The grain inside would remain undisturbed until tomorrow when it would be accessed for use in preparing food and baking bread. Storage areas were dark and silent, with no reason for anyone to enter them during the evening or night when grain was not needed. The containers would be opened again in the morning when daily routines of food preparation began, as they began each day at the same time. Grain waited in the sealed vessels as it had waited through countless nights before this particular evening, now passing forward slowly into darkness. Fires in homes were reduced to coals that would be kept alive through the night for rekindling in the morning when they were needed. The warmth from fires diminished as fuel was no longer added to maintain the heat that had been present during the day. Rooms cooled gradually as evening progressed, and the warmth from fires was not sufficient to maintain daytime temperatures inside the spaces occupied. People would cover themselves with blankets when they slept to stay warm through the cooler hours of night that lay ahead of them. Fires would be rebuilt tomorrow when morning came and heat was needed again for cooking and for warmth in the living spaces used. Lamps were lit in some homes where people remained awake for tasks that needed to be completed before sleep or for time spent together before retiring. The light from lamps was dim and created shadows that moved on walls as air currents caused flames to flicker in their vessels. Oil was consumed slowly as lamps burned and would need to be refilled when the supply in each lamp was exhausted from use. Most lamps would be extinguished before people went to sleep to conserve oil for tomorrow evening when lamps would be lit again. The pattern of lighting and extinguishing lamps repeated each evening and morning as part of the daily routine followed in households throughout the city. Doors were closed and secured as people settled into their homes for the night that was beginning as darkness replaced the light of evening. Latches were fastened and doors were checked to ensure they were properly closed against the night air and against entry by those not belonging. The closing of doors marked the transition from the public activity of day to the private rest of night in households everywhere present. Doors would remain closed until morning when they would be opened again and people would emerge to begin another day. The pattern of opening and closing followed the rhythm of day and night in cycles that repeated without end or variation from the expected sequence. Children were settled for sleep after evening meals had been eaten and final tasks had been completed in preparation for night. Voices grew quiet as sleep came to the young ones tired from the day's play and activities they had engaged in since waking. Adults moved quietly to avoid disturbing children who had already fallen asleep in their places on mats or beds arranged for them. The homes grew quieter as more people settled into sleep and the sounds of evening activity faded into the silence of night approaching. Sleep would last through the dark hours until morning came and waking began the cycle of daily activity once more as it always began each day. The city rested in the darkness of night that had settled over it as evening faded into the hours when most people slept. Sounds were occasional and muted as activity had ceased in most places and only minimal movement occurred in streets and buildings standing silent. The night would continue through the hours ahead until dawn approached and light began to return to the sky above the city. Morning would bring the resumption of activity and the beginning of another day that would follow the same patterns as today. The routines would continue in their familiar cycles as they had continued before and would continue tomorrow and in all the days following after this night had passed into morning once again. Had been displayed all day. Stray dogs moved through the spaces searching for scraps of food dropped or discarded during trading hours. Wind moved dust and small bits of material across the open area now devoid of the crowds present earlier. The market would fill again tomorrow with vendors and buyers repeating the same activities as today and yesterday. Nothing remained to indicate what had been sold or who had been present during the day now ended completely. Cooking fires in homes were reduced to coals that would stay warm until morning when they were needed again. Families sat near the fading warmth and spoke quietly about matters that did not require much energy or thought. Lamplight flickered on faces grown tired from the day's work and activities completed since waking many hours ago. Conversations ended naturally as people prepared to sleep and rest for the night ahead of them now. The rooms grew darker as lamps were extinguished one by one in households throughout the city around them. Grain storage remained undisturbed through the night with containers sealed as they had been left at day's end. Mice moved in spaces between walls searching for any food accessible to them in the darkness everywhere present. The grain would be measured out again in the morning for the day's baking and cooking needs as usual. Storage areas were quiet and still with no activity until people returned to access what was kept there. The grain waited in sealed vessels as it had waited through countless nights before this particular one now. Floors swept during the day would collect dust again overnight as air moved through rooms and doorways left open. The cleanliness achieved through repeated sweeping was temporary and would need to be restored again tomorrow morning. Brooms rested in corners where they had been placed after the final sweeping of the day's efforts ended. The floors would be swept again when morning came in the same manner as they had been swept today. Nothing about the task would change from one day to the next in any noticeable way observable. Animals slept in their pens and stalls or stood resting in positions that required little effort to maintain through darkness. Sounds of movement and breathing were occasional in the stillness of the night surrounding them on all sides. They would be fed and watered again when morning came and their care resumed as it did daily. The animals required the same attention every day regardless of weather or other circumstances affecting the people responsible for them. Their needs were predictable and met through routines that varied little over time, passing steadily forward always. Children slept deeply after the exertions of play and the small tasks they had been given during the day. Parents checked on them occasionally to ensure they remained covered and comfortable through the cooling night air now present. Sleep was undisturbed by dreams or movements for most of the young ones resting in the darkness of their homes. They would wake when morning came and light returned to begin another day similar to the one just ended. Their routines would continue tomorrow as they had continued today without significant change or interruption in the patterns established. Neighbors retired to their own spaces after final exchanges in courtyards or doorways shared between households living close together. The sounds of voices faded as people moved inside and closed doors behind them for the night's duration ahead. Courtyards became silent except for occasional sounds of animals or distant activity in other parts of the city beyond. The spaces would remain empty and dark until morning brought people out again to resume their daily interactions and work. Nothing would change in the courtyards during the hours of darkness now settling over everything around them completely. Night settled over the city in the same way it had settled on previous nights without variation. Darkness filled streets and alleys where activity had been constant during the hours of daylight just past. Lamps glowed in some windows, casting small amounts of light into the blackness surrounding each building closely. Most households had extinguished their lamps to conserve oil for future use when it would be needed again. The city rested in a quietness that would last until dawn approached and people began to wake once more. Some people remained awake for tasks that could only be done during the night's cooler temperatures and darkness. Bakers prepared dough that would rise slowly through the hours before morning baking began at the usual time. Hands kneaded the mixture in dim light from lamps placed nearby on surfaces cleared for this work. The rhythm of kneading was steady and required no conscious thought from those who had performed it countless times. Dough was shaped and set aside to rest until it was ready for the ovens tomorrow at dawn. Night watchmen walked routes through sections of the city they had been assigned to patrol until morning came. Footsteps echoed on stone streets empty of the crowds that filled them during the day's business hours. Doors were checked to ensure they remained closed and secured as they had been left by their owners. The watchmen carried lamps or torches that created small circles of light moving through the surrounding darkness slowly. They would walk these same routes tomorrow night and the night after in continuous repetition of duty assigned. Dogs barked occasionally in response to sounds or movements detected in the darkness around them nearby or distant. The barking was answered by other dogs in a pattern that spread across neighborhoods and then faded into silence. Animals settled again into sleep or watchful rest after the disturbance passed and quiet returned to the streets. The sounds were familiar to those who lived in the city and did not cause alarm or concern. Night sounds were expected and ignored by people trying to sleep in their homes throughout the area. Fires and kilns continued to burn with heat that glowed through cracks in the sealed doors covering openings. The clay inside hardened further as hours passed and temperatures remained high enough to complete the transformation process. No one tended the fires during the night as the fuel had been arranged to burn at the needed rate. Morning would bring workers to open the kilns and remove pieces that had been fired successfully overnight here. The process had been repeated in the same way for as long as the potters could remember clearly. Looms stood silent in dark workshops where no work was being done during these hours of rest. The fabric stretched on frames remained in the same position it had held when work stopped at day's end. Threads would not move until hands returned to operate the shuttles through the patterns established in the weaving. The looms waited without change through the night, just as they waited every night when not in use. Work would resume tomorrow in the same manner it had been performed today and all the days before. Leather softened in water where it had been placed to soak overnight before shaping could continue tomorrow. The material absorbed moisture slowly in the darkness of the workshop now empty of workers and their activity. Pieces would be removed in the morning and worked while they remained pliable from the soaking process completed. The same pieces of leather had been soaking and drying in cycles for days as work progressed on them. Tomorrow would bring the next step in the process that would eventually result in finished items for use. Ovens remained cold after fires had burned out completely hours earlier in the evening just past. Ashes settled in the spaces where wood had burned to provide heat for baking bread during the day. The ovens would be cleaned in the morning before new fires were started for the next round of baking. Cold stone held no warmth after so many hours without fire burning inside the chambers built for this purpose. Heat would return tomorrow when fuel was placed and lit to begin the daily cycle of bread production again. Forges were dark and cold with no glow remaining from the fires that had burned throughout the day earlier. Metal tools rested on benches where they had been placed after the final tasks were completed at evening's approach. The workshop smelled of smoke and metal even in the absence of active fires and work being performed. Tomorrow would bring the same work that had been done today, beginning with lighting fires in the forge pits. The cycle would continue as it had continued for years before this particular night, now passing slowly forward. Stone blocks remained in yards where they had been left after workers departed for their homes at day's end. Moonlight, when present, illuminated the rough surfaces of stone waiting to be transported or shaped further tomorrow. Dust that had been stirred during the day's work now lay still on every surface in the yard's space. No sounds came from the area except occasional movements of small animals passing through in the darkness around everything. The stones would be there in the morning exactly as they were now during the night's quiet hours. Fountains continued their constant flow of water through the night without pause or interruption from any source present. The sound of water moving remained steady and unchanging whether anyone was near to hear it or not. Occasional people came to draw water for needs that arose during the night's duration in their households nearby. The fountains served without awareness of day or night or the presence of those who used them regularly. Water flowed now as it would flow tomorrow and had flowed yesterday in the same continuous manner always. Streets remained empty except for the watchmen who moved through them on their assigned routes, periodically passing by. Stones underfoot were cool after releasing the heat absorbed during the day from sun shining down on them. Shadows were deep in areas where no lamps burned in windows or doorways along the way through passages. The streets would fill again tomorrow with people and animals, and the sounds of activity resumed after rest. Nothing changed in the streets during the night except the absence of those who filled them during daylight hours. Markets were completely empty and dark with no activity or presence of any kind during these hours of night. The spaces that had been crowded with vendors and buyers now held only silence and stillness around them. Small animals searched through debris for food overlooked or dropped during the day's trading and transactions completed. The market would transform again tomorrow when vendors returned to set up their displays of goods for sale. The empty space waited for the return of activity that would come with morning light, as it always did. Homes were dark and quiet with families sleeping in positions they had found comfortable for rest through the night. Breathing was the primary sound within rooms where people lay on mats or beds covered with blankets against cool air. Children slept without moving in the deep rest that came easily to them after days of play and activity. Adults shifted occasionally in their sleep but remained largely still until morning came to wake them for another day. The homes would remain quiet until dawn brought the first stirrings of movement and waking throughout the city around them. Grain storage areas were undisturbed by human activity during the night's passage through time toward morning ahead. Sealed containers held their contents protected from moisture and pests that might damage what was stored inside carefully. The grain would be accessed again when people woke and began preparations for the day's meals and baking needs. Storage areas were dark and silent with no reason for anyone to enter them during these hours of rest. The grain waited as it had waited through every night in the same sealed vessels that protected it always. Animals slept or rested in their pens and stalls without disturbance from those who cared for them during daylight. Sounds of their presence were minimal during the night when activity ceased and rest came to them as well. They would be fed and tended again when morning arrived and their handlers returned to resume daily care routines. The animals required the same attention every morning regardless of what had occurred the day or night before this one. Their needs were constant and predictable in ways that made caring for them a simple routine. Courtyards remained empty and silent through the night with no one present in the open spaces shared by households. Stones that formed the ground surface cooled further as night progressed toward the hours before dawn would come. The spaces would remain unused until morning brought people out to begin their daily activities and interactions with neighbors. Courtyards served their function during daylight and were abandoned to darkness when night came to the city regularly. Nothing happened in these spaces during the hours when people were sleeping in rooms surrounding them closely. Doors remained closed and latched as they had been secured before people retired for the night's rest. Wood of the doors was cool in the night air that had settled over everything exposed to it. The doors would be opened again when morning came and people emerged to begin their daily routines and tasks. Closed doors marked the boundary between the interior spaces of homes and the streets outside where night held presence. The doors would remain closed until dawn approached and the patterns of opening began once more as they always did. Darkness continued through the hours before dawn with little change in the conditions present throughout the city's spaces. The quietness that had settled earlier remained undisturbed except for occasional sounds from animals or watchmen moving through streets. Most people slept deeply in the positions they had found when lying down hours earlier for rest. The night progressed slowly toward morning without any indication that change was approaching from the darkness around everything. Time passed in a manner that could not be measured by those who were sleeping peacefully now. Dough continued to rise in bowls where it had been placed by bakers working in the night's earlier hours. The mixture expanded slowly as the process occurred without any attention from those who had prepared it before. Morning would bring the next steps in bread making when the dough reached the proper state for shaping. The rising happened in the same way it had happened countless times before in these same bowls and spaces. Nothing about the process differed from one night to the next in any observable or significant way. Watchmen completed their routes and began walking them again in the same direction as before without variation in pattern. Steps were counted unconsciously as the familiar paths were followed through streets known from many previous nights of duty. Doors that had been checked earlier were checked again to ensure nothing had changed during the time past. The watchmen saw the same shadows and heard the same occasional sounds that accompanied every night's patrol work. Their presence provided security through simple repetition of movement and observation throughout the assigned areas of responsibility given. Dogs that had barked earlier now slept or rested quietly in the places where they spent each night regularly. The occasional stirring of an animal was the only movement in streets otherwise completely still and empty of activity. Breathing and small sounds of shifting were all that indicated the presence of living creatures in the darkness everywhere. The dogs would wake when morning came and people began to move through the streets once more with purpose. Until then the animals rested as they rested every night in the same locations used repeatedly over time. Kilns maintained their heat as fuel continued to burn inside the sealed chambers where clay pieces were being fired. The glow from cracks remained constant through the hours as the process continued at the temperature needed for transformation. No adjustment was needed or possible during the night when no one attended the kilns at all. The firing would complete on its own according to the way fuel had been arranged before sealing began earlier. Morning would reveal whether the firing had been successful or if pieces had cracked in the heat applied. Workshops remained dark and undisturbed with all tools and materials in the positions they had been left at day's end. Dust settled on surfaces during the night as it settled every night when no activity stirred the air inside. The spaces would remain this way until workers returned to resume the tasks that had been ongoing for days. Nothing would change in the workshops during these hours of darkness and absence of human presence continuing through now. Work would begin again tomorrow exactly where it had ended today without any loss of continuity or progress made. Water that had been placed for soaking leather remained unchanged in containers where pieces had been submerged hours before. The material continued to absorb moisture at the rate determined by its thickness and the water's temperature around it. Morning would bring workers to remove the pieces and continue with the next steps in the process of making items. The soaking happened without attention or monitoring during the night as it happened every night when this step occurred. The process required only time and water to achieve the softening needed for work to continue successfully tomorrow. Ashes in cold ovens remained where they had settled after fires burned out completely in the evening hours earlier. The ovens held no warmth after so many hours without any source of heat present inside the chambers built. Cleaning would happen in the morning before new fires were started for the day's baking work to begin again. The ashes would be removed and discarded in the same manner they were removed every morning without exception observed. Cold ovens would be transformed into hot ovens through the routine of fire building performed countless times before by bakers. Metal tools rested on benches in workshops where no fires burned and no work was being done during darkness. The smell of smoke and metal lingered in the air even without active fires producing new smoke at present. Tools would be taken up again when workers returned and fires were lit in forges to begin metalworking once more. The tools served the same functions each day and were used in the same ways by hands familiar with them. Nothing about the tools or their use would be different tomorrow from how they had been used today or yesterday. Stone yards remained silent with blocks sitting in positions where they had been placed after completion or during work paused. Moonlight moved across surfaces as the night progressed and the moon traveled its path across the sky above. Shadows shifted on the stones, but the stones themselves did not move or change in any way observable during darkness. Morning would bring workers back to continue shaping or to load blocks onto carts for transport to building sites elsewhere. The stones waited without awareness of time passing or morning approaching gradually from the darkness present everywhere now. Water flowed from fountains in the steady stream that continued regardless of whether anyone was present to use it or not. The sound remained constant through all hours of night just as it remained constant during the day when people came regularly. Fountains served their purpose continuously without rest or interruption from any cause that might stop the flow of water moving. The water that flowed now would be draw ends or on flat stones. Water was added to the flour and the mixture was kneaded until it reached the proper consistency for shaping into loaves. The dough would be set aside to rise before baking occurred later in the day or tomorrow morning when ovens were hot. The process of making bread from grain was familiar to those who performed it and required no special attention or thought. Bread would be baked and consumed and the process would begin again with new grain ground into flour for the next batch. Floors that had been swept earlier in the day were swept again as dust had accumulated from activity and from air moving through open doorways. Brooms were used in the same motions as before to push debris toward exits where it could be removed from interior spaces. The task was repeated multiple times each day as dust settled constantly on all surfaces exposed to air circulating through rooms. Sweeping was necessary to maintain conditions that were considered acceptable for living and working in the spaces occupied by people here. The dust would return and sweeping would be done again tomorrow in the same manner as it was done today. Animals that had been working earlier were now resting in shade or in stalls where they had been taken by their handlers. Water and feed were provided to replenish what had been consumed during the morning's labor pulling carts or carrying loads through the city. The animals would rest until they were needed again for additional work later in the day if required by their handlers. Some animals had completed their work for the day and would remain in their stalls until tomorrow when the routine began again. The care of animals followed the same pattern every day as their needs were predictable and constant regardless of other circumstances. Children had been called back from play to help with tasks in their households or to eat meals prepared by adults. Small hands were put to work carrying items or holding things steady while adults performed more complex tasks requiring skill and strength. The children worked quietly or chattered among themselves as they helped with whatever was needed from them currently by their parents. Work for children was lighter than work for adults but still contributed to the household's functioning and maintenance throughout each day. The children would return to play when their help was no longer needed or when adults released them from their tasks assigned. Neighbors continued to encounter each other during movements through shared spaces and streets connecting their homes to other locations in the area. Greetings were exchanged and brief comments were made about the day's progress or about matters affecting the neighborhood where they lived. The interactions were comfortable and required little effort as the same people encountered each other regularly in the same places during their daily routines. Information was shared about practical matters and about events that might affect those living nearby in coming days or weeks. The conversations ended when people needed to continue to their destinations or when there was nothing more to be said. Garments that had been mended earlier were now being worn by those for whom the repairs had been made during morning hours. The mended areas were visible but acceptable as clothing was meant to be used until it could no longer serve its purpose. New tiers would appear over time and would be mended when there was opportunity to do the work required. The cycle of wearing and mending and wearing again continued until garments were too damaged to repair usefully anymore. Fabric was valuable and clothing was used for as long as possible before being discarded or repurposed for other uses in households. Afternoon hours continued with the same activities that had been ongoing since morning without significant change in what was being done. Heat had increased as the sun moved higher and remained at levels that made work more tiring than it had been earlier. Workers adjusted their pace to accommodate the temperature but continued with their tasks in the same manner as before the heat arrived. Shade was sought when possible during brief pauses taken from labor that would resume after moments of rest in cooler areas. The day progressed in its familiar pattern toward evening when temperatures would begin to drop again as they dropped every day. Pottery that had been shaped earlier now dried on shelves were moved around the pieces placed there this morning. The clay changed color gradually as moisture left the material and evaporated into the surrounding air moving through the workshop. Pieces would remain on the shelves until they were dry enough to be handled without damage to the shapes created. The drying process required time and could not be rushed without risking cracks or collapse of the forms made. Dried pieces would eventually be loaded into kilns for firing that would complete their transformation into usable vessels for households. Fabric continued to grow on looms as shuttles passed through threads in the same repetitive motion maintained since work began. The weavers sat in their positions working steadily without much variation in the pace of their labor throughout the afternoon. Hands moved automatically through the pattern as eyes watched for errors that might require correction before too much work was completed. The fabric would reach its intended length eventually and would be removed from the loom to make room for new work. The same looms would be used again tomorrow to create more fabric in the same manner as today and yesterday. Leather items neared completion as the final stitches were made to join pieces together into finished goods ready for sale. The work had progressed through the day from cutting to punching holes to stitching the pieces together with thread pulled tight. Workers examined the finished items to ensure the stitching was secure and the shapes were correct for their intended uses. The completed goods were set with others finished earlier and would be taken to market or delivered to buyers who had ordered them. New pieces of leather would be prepared tomorrow to begin the process again with different items or similar items needed. Bread baking continued through the afternoon as new loaves were placed in ovens that remained hot from fires maintained since morning. The cycle of placing and removing loaves had been repeated many times since work began at dawn many hours ago. Bakers worked steadily to produce the amount of bread needed to meet demand from customers coming throughout the day to purchase. Some loaves were sold as soon as they cooled while others were set aside for later sale or for consumption by the baker's family. The ovens would remain hot until evening when fires would be allowed to burn down and baking would stop for the day. Metal items that had been polished earlier were now being taken to market or stored for later sale to customers seeking them. The polished surfaces reflected light and appeared finished and ready for use by those who would purchase them soon. Workers gathered items together and prepared them for transport to the locations where they would be sold or delivered as arranged. New metal pieces would be worked on tomorrow, beginning with heating in the forge and continuing through the steps of shaping and polishing. The same work would be done tomorrow as had been done today in the workshops where metalworking occurred regularly every day. Stone blocks continued to be placed in buildings under construction, with workers positioning each piece carefully according to the plans being followed. Mortar was applied and blocks were adjusted to ensure they fit properly with those already in place, forming walls rising higher. The work was slow and required attention to keep the walls straight and properly aligned as they were built upward. Each block added brought the structure closer to completion, but much work remained before the building would be finished entirely. Construction would continue tomorrow and in the days following until the project was completed according to the plans made before work began. Water carriers continued their trips, though the frequency had decreased somewhat as the afternoon progressed toward evening when demand would lessen. The routes walked remained the same and the work remained as tiring as it had been earlier in the day. Carriers rested briefly between trips to recover strength before filling containers again and walking back to deliver water where it was needed. The work would end when evening came and most people had obtained the water they needed for the day's activities and preparations. Tomorrow the carriers would begin again walking the same routes to supply water needed for another day of cooking and washing and drinking. Markets saw fewer buyers as the afternoon advanced and most people had completed their purchasing for the day's needs already. Vendors with goods remaining called out to those passing by in hopes of making additional sales before the day ended. Prices were sometimes reduced for items that needed to be sold before they spoiled or lost value from sitting unsold too long. Transactions continued, but at a slower pace than during the morning when the market had been crowded with buyers seeking goods. Vendors would begin packing soon when it became clear that few additional buyers would come before evening arrived and the market closed. Food that had been cooking since morning was now ready or nearly ready for the evening meal that would be served to families. The long cooking had softened ingredients and blended flavors together into the dishes that would be consumed when everyone gathered to eat. Final adjustments were made to seasoning and consistency as the food was checked and tasted by those who had prepared it. Pots would be moved from fires when the food was ready and would be served into bowls or onto plates for eating. The same dishes would be prepared again tomorrow using similar ingredients and following the same methods of cooking applied today and before. Floors were swept once more as the afternoon's activity had brought in additional dust from outside and for movements within the spaces. Brooms pushed debris in the same directions as earlier sweepings had pushed material toward exits and doorways leading outside the buildings. The sweeping was done quickly as it had been done multiple times already today and would be done again tomorrow. Dust would settle again overnight, and in the morning sweeping would resume as part of the daily routine of maintaining cleanliness. The cycle continued without end as dust was constant and sweeping was necessary to manage its accumulation on all surfaces present. Animals that had rested earlier were put to work again if their services were needed for tasks in the afternoon hours. Those not needed remained in shade or in stalls where they had been left to rest from morning labor completed. Handlers moved animals to where they were needed and directed their work pulling carts or carrying loads to various destinations required. The animals worked at the pace set by their handlers and stopped when directed to rest or when work was completed for them. Evening would bring the end of work and animals would be returned to their pens and stalls for feeding and rest through the night. Children played again in the spaces available after completing the tasks they had been given during the earlier part of the day. Games resumed where they had been interrupted, or new games were started using different objects or involving different children from the neighborhood. Voices and laughter filled courtyards and streets where children gathered to play in the time remaining before evening meals and the end of daylight. Adults paid little attention to the play unless it became too loud or unless someone needed to be called back for additional tasks. The children would play until called inside for the evening, when families gathered for meals and rest from the day's activities and work. Conversations between neighbors occurred less frequently as people were occupied with completing their own work before evening arrived and daylight faded. Brief exchanges happened when paths crossed, but most people moved directly to their destinations without stopping to talk at length with others encountered. The pace of activity remained steady as tasks were completed and new tasks were begun in the time remaining before the day ended. People would have more time for conversation later when work was finished, and evening brought gatherings in courtyards and doorways shared between households. The afternoon continued toward evening in the same gradual progression that occurred every day without variation from the expected pattern of time passing. Garments worn during the day showed signs of the work that had been done while wearing them throughout the hours since morning. Dust and stains marked the fabric in places where contact with materials or surfaces had occurred during labor and activities. The garments would be brushed or washed when they became too soiled to wear comfortably or acceptably in the presence of others. Cleaning would happen when there was time and opportunity to perform the work required to restore the clothing to a usable condition. The same garments would be worn again after cleaning until they needed cleaning once more from use during daily routines and work performed. The afternoon moved toward its later hours as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon in the distance. Work continued in the same manner it had continued since morning, with tasks being performed in familiar ways by those who did them. Hands moved through motions that had been repeated so many times that conscious thought was no longer required for their completion. The rhythm of work remained steady, though fatigue had increased from the hours of effort already expended since dawn today. Tasks would be completed or would be left unfinished to continue tomorrow when work resumed in the same locations and with the same tools. Pottery remained on shelves drying in air that moved through the workshop in currents flowing from openings to other openings present. The pieces sat without attention as the drying happened on its own over time that could not be shortened or hurried along. Workers checked the pieces occasionally by touching them to assess whether drying had progressed enough to allow handling or moving to different positions. The clay would continue to dry through the evening and into tomorrow until it reached the state needed for the next step. Drying was a process that required only time and air and happened the same way regardless of observation or intervention attempted. Fabric on looms continued to accumulate rows as shuttles passed through threads in the pattern being followed since this piece was started. The work had been ongoing for days and would continue for more days until the fabric reached the length required for its use. Weavers maintained their pace through the afternoon despite tiredness in hands and backs from sitting in the same position working steadily. The fabric would be finished eventually and another piece would be started using the same loom and similar materials as before. The work of weaving continued in cycles of starting and finishing that repeated without end as fabric was always needed for various purposes. Leather items that had been completed were gathered together for transport to market or for storage until buyers came for them. The finished goods were counted and checked to ensure quality was acceptable before they were taken from the workshop where they had been made. Workers prepared new leather for soaking overnight so work could continue tomorrow with fresh material ready to be shaped and stitched. The workshop would be used again tomorrow for the same work that had been done today and would be done again in the days following. The process of making leather goods followed the same steps each time items were created from raw material to finished products. Bread baking slowed as the day advanced and the amount of dough prepared in the morning had been mostly used for loaves already baked. The final loaves were placed in ovens that would be allowed to cool after these last batches were removed when ready. Bakers would clean the ovens and prepare them for tomorrow's work when new dough would be shaped and baked in the same manner. The smell of bread had been present all day and would fade when baking stopped and ovens cooled overnight without fires. Tomorrow the smell would return when fires were lit and baking began again in the morning as it always began each day. Metal work had slowed as fires in forges were allowed to burn lower in preparation for the end of the day's labor. Final pieces were finished and set aside to cool completely before being handled or moved from the workshop where they had been made. Tools were cleaned and put away in positions where they would be found easily tomorrow when work resumed at the forges again. The workshops would be quiet overnight and would fill with activity again when workers returned to begin another day of metalworking tasks. The same tools would be used and the same processes would be followed as had been followed today and yesterday before. Stone work continued at building sites where daylight remained sufficient for workers to see what they were doing with the blocks. Each block placed brought small progress toward completion of structures being built, but much work remained to be done in coming days. Workers would continue until light faded too much for safe work to proceed with heavy stones being positioned and secured. The sites would be left overnight with work resuming tomorrow when light returned and workers came back to continue building where they had stopped today. Construction progressed slowly over many days and weeks as buildings took shape from foundations laid earlier to walls rising now. Water carriers made fewer trips as the day advanced toward evening and demand for water decreased in households and workshops everywhere. The work remained the same as it had been all day, with containers filled and carried along familiar routes to destinations known. Fatigue made the work harder as the day progressed, but the task was necessary and was completed regardless of tiredness felt. The carriers would stop when evening came and would begin again tomorrow, walking the same routes to deliver water needed for another day. The routine of carrying water was the same each day and required the same effort regardless of how many times it had been done before. Markets were quieter now, with many vendors already departed after selling their goods or packing unsold items for storage or transport back. The remaining vendors called out occasionally, but with less energy than earlier when buyers had been more numerous in the market spaces. Final transactions were completed, with buyers seeking last opportunities to purchase items before vendors closed their stalls for the day entirely. The market would empty completely by evening and would remain empty through the night until vendors returned tomorrow to begin trading again. The cycle of filling and emptying repeated each day as markets served their function during daylight hours only and were abandoned at night. Food prepared during the day was ready for evening meals that would be served when families gathered after work ended today. Pots were moved from fires or kept warm near coals that remained from the cooking fires used throughout the day for preparation. Family members would return soon from their various locations and work would stop as evening meals were eaten together in households nearby. Someone mentioned where cheaper grain could be purchased at a different market stall. Another person reported that a craftsman had completed an item that had been ordered previously. The information was acknowledged and sometimes acted upon during the following days if it seemed useful. These exchanges occurred spontaneously throughout the day when paths crossed in streets or courtyards shared. Garments were washed when they became too dirty to wear without causing discomfort or embarrassment. Fabric was scrubbed against stones or rubbed with hands after being soaked in water. Soap made from animal fat and ash was used to remove stains and odors. The garments were wrung out to remove excess water before being hung to dry. Drying took hours or days depending on the weather and the thickness of the cloth. Merchants counted coins received from sales made during the morning and early afternoon hours. The amounts were noted mentally or marked on tablets with styluses pressed into wax. Profits were estimated based on the difference between purchase cost and selling price achieved. The calculations were simple and done quickly by those experienced in such matters regularly. Money was stored in locked boxes or pouches kept on the person at all times. Wells saw increased use during midday as people needed water more frequently in the heat. Buckets were lowered and raised in continuous cycles as long as people waited their turn. Ropes were against the stones lining the well openings and frayed gradually over time. The water was cool compared to the air and was often drunk immediately after being drawn. Some water was poured over heads and arms to provide temporary relief from the temperature. Doors remained open to allow air to move through rooms when there was any breeze. The movement of air provided small amounts of relief from the still heat inside buildings. People positioned themselves near openings where any cooling effect could be felt most strongly. The air was often too warm to provide much comfort, but it was better than complete stillness. Windows without shutters allowed light and air to enter throughout the day's duration. Courtyards were used less during the hottest hours as the stones underfoot became too hot. People retreated to covered walkways along the edges where roofs provided some shade from above. The stones radiated heat absorbed from the sun beating down on them since morning. Animals avoided walking across the open spaces when possible during this time of day. The courtyards would be used again when shadows lengthened and temperatures began to drop slightly. Olive oil lamps were prepared for use later when darkness would require light inside buildings. Wicks were trimmed to lengths that would burn steadily without smoking excessively or going out. Oil levels in the lamps were checked and refilled from larger containers when necessary. The lamps were placed in positions where they would be needed after the sun set. Preparation of lamps was a task done in the afternoon before evening activities began. Afternoon work continued with the same tasks begun earlier in the day now progressing further. Hands moved through familiar motions that had been repeated since morning without significant change. Tools were used in the same ways they had been used for hours already. Progress was made slowly as each action added small amounts to what had been completed. The work would continue until light faded or until exhaustion made it necessary to stop. Clay vessels that had dried were now ready to be placed in kilns for firing. Workers arranged pieces carefully to fit as many as possible into the available space. The kiln door was sealed with clay mixed with straw to hold heat inside. Fuel was added to the fire beneath and air was controlled to reach the needed temperature. The firing would continue through the night and into the following day without interruption. Weavers remained at their looms working through the afternoon at the same steady pace. Shuttles continued to pass through threads in the repetitive pattern established hours before. Backs and shoulders ached from sitting in the same position for extended periods of time. Short breaks were taken to stand and stretch before returning to the work again. The fabric grew longer with each pass of the shuttle through the loom frame. Leather workers stitched pieces together that had been prepared during the morning and early afternoon. Needles were pushed through holes punched earlier and thread was pulled tight to secure the join. The work required concentration to keep stitches even and properly spaced along the seam. Finished items were inspected briefly before being set aside with others completed that day. New pieces were begun to replace those that had been finished and removed. Ovens remained hot from morning baking and were used again for additional loaves made from dough. The dough had been rising during the earlier hours and was now ready to be shaped. Hands formed the mixture into rounds that were placed on the same paddles used before. The process was identical to the one followed in the morning with no variation. Bread would be ready when the crust reached the same color as previous batches baked. Metal items were polished using cloths and abrasive materials that smoothed the surfaces gradually over time. The work removed small imperfections left from the forging and shaping process completed earlier. Hands moved in circles applying pressure to create shine on the metal being worked. The task was simple but required time and patience to achieve the desired result evenly. Polished items were placed with others waiting to be sold or delivered to those who ordered them. Stone dust was swept from the work areas where masons had been shaping blocks all day. The fine powder covered everything nearby and needed to be removed regularly to keep conditions tolerable. Brooms pushed the dust into piles that were shoveled into containers or swept outside into alleys. The dust settled again almost immediately as work continued, creating more of it constantly. The cycle of sweeping and dust accumulation repeated throughout each day work was performed here. Water carriers made their trips less frequently as the afternoon progressed toward evening and demand decreased. The routes walked were the same ones taken earlier with no changes in direction or destination. Muscles were tired from the weight carried repeatedly since morning began many hours ago. The task would continue until the day ended and would begin again tomorrow at the same time. There was no variation in this work from one day to the next in most cases. Vendors began to gather items that had not sold during the day for storage or transport. Goods were wrapped in cloths or placed back into containers brought that morning to the market. Prices were sometimes reduced for items that needed to be sold before they spoiled or lost value. Final transactions were completed with buyers seeking bargains at the end of the trading day. The market would empty gradually as vendors departed to return the following day with similar goods. Cooking continued in homes as evening meals were prepared using methods identical to those used earlier. Vegetables were added to pots that had been simmering throughout the afternoon hours already. Stirring ensured even cooking and prevented ingredients from sticking to the bottom of vessels over fires. The smell of food filled rooms and drifted into streets where people passed by outside. Meals would be ready when family members returned from their work in various locations nearby. Grain storage areas were checked to ensure containers remained sealed against pests and moisture from the air. Lids were examined and replaced if they did not fit tightly over the openings of vessels. The grain inside was inspected for signs of insects or spoilage that would make it unsuitable. Contaminated grain was removed and fed to animals or discarded depending on the extent of the damage. Good grain was measured out for the next day's use in baking or cooking meals. Floors were swept again as the day's activities had brought in more dust and debris from outside. The same brooms were used in the same motions as earlier sweeping efforts that morning and midday. The task had become automatic and required no conscious thought about how to perform it correctly. Dust was pushed to doorways and removed from the interior spaces, being cleaned throughout the city. Swept floors would collect dust again overnight and need sweeping tomorrow without fail or exception. Animals were led back to pens and stalls from places where they had been working or resting. Harnesses were removed and hung on pegs where they would remain until needed again tomorrow. Feed was distributed in amounts considered appropriate for the size and type of each animal present. Water troughs were checked and refilled if they had been emptied during the day's heat. The animals settled into familiar positions for the night that was approaching as light began to fade. Children returned to their homes when called by adults who had finished their work for the day. Faces and hands were washed to remove dirt accumulated during hours of play in streets. Clean clothing was not provided as garments would only become soiled again during the next day's activities. Evening meals were eaten together with family members who had been working in different places since morning. The meals were similar to those eaten on previous evenings in content and in manner of consumption. Neighbors gathered in courtyards or doorways to talk briefly before retiring inside for the evening ahead. The conversations covered the same topics discussed during earlier encounters throughout the day without much new information. Comments were made about the weather or work completed or plans for the following day's tasks. The exchanges were comfortable and required little effort as the subjects were familiar to everyone participating. People dispersed to their homes when darkness made it difficult to see faces clearly anymore. Garments that had been washed earlier were taken down from where they had been hanging to dry. The fabric was examined to determine if it had dried completely or needed more time exposed. Damp items were left hanging until the next day when they might be ready for use. Dry clothing was folded and placed in storage areas or left out for wearing the next morning. The same garments would be worn repeatedly until they required washing again in several days or a week. Merchants closed their shops by bringing inside items that had been displayed outside during trading hours. Shutters were fastened over windows to secure the spaces against entry during the night to come. Coins and valuable items were locked in boxes or hidden in places known only to the owners. Final counts were made of goods remaining to determine what needed to be replenished from suppliers soon. The shops would open again tomorrow when light returned and customers began to appear in the streets. Wells were used less as evening approached and people completed their final tasks requiring water for the day. The area around the well openings became quiet after being busy with activity since morning began. Buckets were taken home by those who had been using them throughout the day's hours. The ropes hung down into the dark water below waiting for use again when tomorrow came. Wells served the same communities year after year with little change in their function or importance. Doors began to close as households prepared for the night and the activities that came with darkness. The sounds of work and conversation diminished as people moved inside their buildings and rooms. Streets became quieter, though some movement and noise continued in certain areas of the city still. The transition from day to evening happened gradually without any clear moment when one ended completely. The patterns of closing and settling in were familiar to everyone living in these spaces together. Courtyards emptied as the last light faded from the sky above the buildings surrounding the open areas. Stones that had been hot during the day now cooled in the evening air, beginning to move. Children were brought inside by parents who settled them for the night ahead without much difficulty. The spaces would be empty and dark until morning brought light again and people emerged to resume activities. The courtyards belonged to the night now and would return to daytime use when the sun rose again. Olive oil lamps were lit in rooms where people would continue activities after darkness made natural light unavailable. Flames flickered and cast moving shadows on walls as air currents moved through the spaces occupied. The light was dim compared to daylight, but sufficient for tasks that did not require precision or detail. Lamps would burn until people went to sleep or until the oil was consumed completely and wicks went dark. The same lamps would be refilled and lit again tomorrow evening at this same time once more. Evening brought routines that followed patterns established over many years in each household and workshop. Fires were banked to preserve coals for rekindling in the morning after the night passed. Embers glowed beneath ash spread over them to slow the burning until they were needed again. The warmth from fires diminished as fuel was no longer added to maintain daytime temperatures inside. Rooms cooled gradually as heat escaped through openings in walls and roofs above sleeping areas. Food remaining from the evening meal was stored in containers or wrapped in cloth for consumption later. Scraps were collected and set aside for animals that would eat them the next day. Pots were wiped clean with rags or rinsed with small amounts of water used sparingly for this purpose. Cooking areas were left ready for use again when morning came and preparations would begin once more. The tasks of cleaning and storing were done quickly as light from lamps was limited and dim. Children were settled onto sleeping mats or beds with blankets pulled over them against the cooling air. Small voices asked questions or made comments that were answered briefly by tired parents nearby. Sleep came quickly to those exhausted from play and activity throughout the day's long hours. Adults moved quietly to avoid waking those who had already drifted into sleep in the darkened rooms. The sounds of the household diminished as each person found their place for the night ahead. Tools were set down in positions where they would be found easily when work resumed tomorrow morning. Handles were wiped free of sweat and dirt accumulated during hours of use throughout the day. Blades were checked one final time for damage that would need repair before being used again. The tools rested in familiar spots where they had been placed at the end of previous days. They would remain there untouched until hands reached for them again after the night passed completely. Workshops became silent as the last workers departed for their homes in the surrounding streets and buildings. Doors were closed and latched to secure materials and goods left inside overnight without supervision or guard. Darkness filled the spaces where activity and noise had been constant since morning light first appeared. The benches and tools waited in stillness for the return of workers who would resume their labor tomorrow. Nothing would change in these spaces during the hours of night that lay ahead now. Potters left kilns burning with fires that would continue through the night unattended by anyone present. The temperature inside would remain high enough to complete the firing process begun that afternoon earlier. Clay vessels inside transformed slowly as heat altered the material into hardened forms that would be useful. The kiln glowed faintly in the darkness of the workshop now empty of people and activity. Morning would bring workers back to open the kiln and remove the finished pieces waiting inside it. Weavers covered their looms with cloths to protect the work in progress from dust overnight and through tomorrow. Shuttles were placed aside in containers where they would not be lost or damaged while not in use. Thread was secured so it would not tangle or unravel during the hours when no one worked at the loom. The fabric created during the day remained stretched on the frame waiting for work to continue after rest. The loom stood in the same position it had occupied for years of use before this particular day. Leather workers hung finished items on pegs or laid them flat on surfaces to await collection by buyers or delivery. Scraps of leather were gathered and saved for possible use in smaller projects later when they might be needed. Needles and thread were put away in containers kept for this purpose after each day's work ended. The workshop smelled of oil and leather as it did every evening after work had ceased for the day. Tomorrow would bring the same tasks performed in the same ways as had been done today and before. Ovens cooled slowly after the final loaves were removed and the fires were allowed to diminish naturally over time. The baking space grew dark as the glow from coals faded to nothing in the absence of new fuel. Ashes would be cleaned out in the morning before fires were started again for the next day's work. Bread remaining unsold was stored or taken home by the baker for household consumption during coming days. The oven would be cold by morning and would need to be heated again from the beginning of the process. Metal items finished during the day were locked away in storage areas secure from theft during the night hours. The forge cooled as no more fuel was added to maintain the heat required for working metal into shapes. Tools used for hammering and shaping were cleaned and placed in their usual positions for tomorrow's use again. The workshop grew cold as warmth from the forge dissipated into the air and left through openings above. Metalwork would resume when morning came and fires were lit once more in the forge pit below. Stone yards became quiet and empty as the last workers left for their homes in the evening darkness. Blocks finished during the day remained where they had been placed waiting for carts to transport them. Dust settled on all surfaces in the absence of activity that had kept it stirred into the air. The yard would remain still and silent through the night until workers returned at dawn tomorrow. The stones waited without change in the positions where they had been left this evening now passing. Water fountains continued to flow whether people drew from them or not during the night hours ahead. The sound of water moving was constant and unchanging as it had been throughout the day just ended. A few people came to fill containers for use during the night or early morning before crowds returned. The fountains served their function without rest or interruption regardless of how many used them at any time. Water would flow through the night and into tomorrow in the same steady manner as always before. Vendors who traveled returned to lodgings or camped in areas designated for those passing through the city temporarily. Goods were secured and animals were tended before the travelers rested from the day's journey and transactions completed. Plans were made for the next day's travel or trading depending on what remained to be sold. The routines of traveling merchants were similar wherever they stopped during their movements between cities and towns. Sleep came to those accustomed to resting in unfamiliar places each night during their journeys back and forth. Markets stood empty with only debris remaining on the ground where goods age. The sun rose over Rome each morning in predictable patterns. Light reached the streets at familiar angles depending on the season. People woke when darkness faded or when roosters called from nearby courtyards. Sleep ended gradually for most residents of the city and surrounding areas. Waking happened without ceremony in most households across the Roman world. Homes were built from materials that required regular care and maintenance. Walls needed periodic repairs to remain standing through seasons and years. Roofs let in rain when tiles shifted or cracked over time. Floors were swept daily to remove dust that accumulated from the street. Doorways opened onto narrow passages between buildings in densely populated neighborhoods. Water was carried from public fountains to homes each day. Clay vessels were filled and refilled as water was used. People walked the same routes to fountains they had used before. The weight of full containers was familiar to those who carried them. Spills were common on uneven stone pathways leading back to doorways. Bread was made or purchased depending on the household and resources. Grain was ground into flour using stones turned by hand or animal. Dough was kneaded on wooden surfaces cleaned after each use. Ovens were shared in some neighborhoods where individuals baked in turn. The smell of baking bread was present in the morning air. Clothing was simple and made from materials that wore down over time. Fabric was woven from wool or linen depending on what was available. Garments were washed when they became too soiled to wear comfortably. Repairs were made to tears and worn areas to extend usefulness. People wore similar styles that had been worn for generations before. Work began when morning tasks in the home were completed or underway. Some people left to labor in workshops or construction sites nearby. Others remained to tend to children or maintain the household throughout the day. Tasks were divided based on age and ability and custom. The division of labor was understood without much discussion in most families. Streets filled with people moving between locations for various purposes each day. Sounds of conversation and work blended together in consistent patterns of noise. Animals were led through passages pulling carts or carrying loads on their backs. Waste was thrown into streets or alleys where it remained until removed. The smell of the city was constant and familiar to its residents. Markets opened when vendors arrived to sell goods brought from surrounding regions. Food and materials were displayed on tables or laid on cloth. Prices were discussed and negotiated in exchanges that followed familiar patterns. Coins changed hands in transactions repeated many times each day across Rome. Buyers returned home with items that would be used and then replaced. The rhythm of the day was shaped by light and temperature. Heat increased as the sun rose higher in the sky above. People adjusted their activities to avoid the hottest portions of the afternoon. Shade was sought in covered areas or inside buildings with thick walls. The day continued in segments that felt similar to previous days. Morning routines began with the same motions repeated from the day before. People rose from sleeping mats or wooden beds that had been used for years. Blankets were folded or pushed aside to be arranged again at nightfall. Feet touched cool floors made of packed earth or stone laid long ago. The first movements of the day were slow and required little thought. Fires needed to be started or rekindled from coals that had burned low. Kindling was kept dry in containers near the hearth or cooking area. Smoke rose through openings in the roof or drifted out through doorways. Flames grew when air reached them and fuel was added carefully. The warmth spread slowly into rooms that had cooled during the night. Children were woken by parents or older siblings who shook them gently. Small faces were wiped with damp cloth to remove sleep from eyes. Clothing was pulled over heads and arms guided through openings in fabric. Shoes were tied or sandals were fastened with straps worn smooth from use. Young ones were fed portions of bread softened in water or milk. Tools were gathered for tasks that would fill the hours ahead predictably. Wooden handles were gripped by hands that had held them many times. Metal edges were checked for sharpness or damage that required attention before use. Items were carried to locations where they would be needed throughout the day. The weight and balance of each tool was known from previous days. Workshops opened when enough light entered through windows or open doorways to see. Benches were cleared of items left from the previous day's labor and tasks. Materials were arranged in positions that made them easy to reach repeatedly. Apprentices arrived to learn skills through repetition under the guidance of experienced workers. The sounds of hammering and sawing began and continued for many hours. Potters shaped clay on wheels that turned when pushed by foot or hand. The same forms were created over and over with small variations in size. Wet clay was smoothed with fingers and tools dipped in water nearby. Finished pieces were set aside to dry before being placed in kilns. Heat transformed the clay into vessels that would be used until they broke. Weavers sat at looms threading fibers through patterns they had made before. Shuttles passed back and forth in rhythmic motions that required little attention. Fabric grew slowly as rows accumulated over hours and days of work. The texture and weight of the cloth was checked periodically by hand. Completed sections were removed and new threads were prepared for the next piece. Leather workers cut hides into shapes used for sandals and bags and straps. Knives followed lines marked with tools or remembered from previous cuts made. Pieces were softened in water and stretched over forms to dry slowly. Stitching joined sections together using needles and thread made from sinew or plant fiber. The smell of leather and oil filled the space where this work happened. Bakers shaped dough into round loaves that would be sold or traded. Hands pressed and folded the mixture until it reached the right consistency. Loaves were placed on paddles and slid into ovens heated by wood fires. The temperature was judged by experience rather than measurement or precise method. Bread was removed when the crust reached the color expected from previous batches. Metal workers heated iron and bronze in forges fueled by charcoal and air. Bellows were pumped to increase the heat until metal softened enough to shape. Hammers struck glowing pieces on anvils in patterns that created useful objects. Sparks scattered and faded as blows landed in steady repetition throughout the morning. Finished items were set aside to cool before being handled or sold. Stonemasons shaped blocks that would be used in buildings under construction. Chisels were struck with mallets to chip away excess material gradually and carefully. Measurements were checked against other stones to ensure pieces would fit together properly. Dust covered hands and arms and faces of workers who performed this labor. The sound of metal hitting stone echoed in yards where this work occurred. Water carriers made trips between fountains and homes and workshops as needed. Vessels were filled and emptied and filled again in cycles throughout the day. Shoulders and backs grew sore from the weight carried over uneven ground. Splashing was common when containers bumped against walls or other people passing. The task was necessary and performed without complaint in most cases observed. Street vendors arranged goods on tables or blankets spread on the ground. Fruits and vegetables were displayed in piles sorted by type and quality. Prices were called out to people passing by who might stop to look. Hands selected items and held them up for inspection before purchasing or moving on. The exchange of coins and goods happened quickly in most transactions. Food was prepared in homes by those who remained while others worked elsewhere. Vegetables were washed and cut into pieces that would cook evenly over fires. Pots were filled with water and ingredients that would simmer for hours. Stirring prevented burning and ensured even heating of the mixture inside each vessel. The smell of cooking spread through rooms and into streets outside. Grain was measured and poured into containers for storage or immediate use daily. Mice and insects were kept away by storing food in sealed vessels when possible. Spoilage was checked for by smell and appearance before consumption was attempted regularly. Waste was minimal as most items were used completely or fed to animals. Nothing of value was discarded without consideration of other possible uses first. Floors were swept with brooms made from bundled twigs or straw tied together. Dust and debris were pushed toward doorways and into streets or alleys outside. The motion was repeated until surfaces appeared clean enough for the day's activities. Brooms wore down over time and were replaced when they no longer functioned. Sweeping happened each morning in most homes and workshops throughout the city. Animals were fed and watered by those responsible for their care each day. Hay was placed in areas where livestock could reach it easily throughout the day. Troughs were filled with water drawn from wells or fountains and carried to locations. Waste was removed from stalls and pens to prevent buildup and unpleasant smells. The routine of animal care was understood by those who performed it regularly. Children played in streets and courtyards when not occupied with tasks or learning. Games were simple and used objects found nearby or passed down from others. Voices rose in shouts and laughter that blended with other city sounds present. Adults paid little attention unless noise became disruptive or someone was injured slightly. Play ended when children were called back for meals or given work to do. Conversations happened between neighbors who encountered each other throughout the day in regular patterns. Topics included weather and prices and events occurring nearby that affected daily life. Information was shared about illnesses or births or deaths in families living close by. The exchanges were brief and followed familiar formats that required little effort or thought. People continued on to their destinations after these interactions ended naturally and predictably. Garments were mended when tears appeared in fabric worn daily by household members. Needles were threaded and stitches were made to close openings in cloth. Patches were sewn over areas too damaged to repair with simple stitching alone. The work was done in light from doorways or windows when other tasks allowed. Mended clothing was worn again until it could no longer be repaired usefully. Merchants traveled between cities and towns carrying goods to sell in different markets. Carts were loaded with items wrapped in cloth or placed in containers. Roads were followed that had been used by traders for many generations before. Stops were made at settlements along routes where transactions could be completed profitably. The journeys were long and required many days of travel in each direction. Wells were maintained by communities that depended on them for water each day. Stones lining the openings were checked for stability and repaired when loose. Ropes were replaced when they frayed from repeated use, lowering buckets down. Water was drawn by hand using containers tied to the ends of ropes. The depth of wells determined how much effort was required for each retrieval. Doors were opened in the morning and closed again at night following patterns. Hinges made sounds that were familiar to those who lived in each building. Latches were fastened to keep doors shut when security or privacy was needed. Wood swelled in dampness and required force to open or close properly sometimes. The same doors were used for years until they rotted or broke completely. Courtyards were shared by families living in buildings arranged around open central spaces. Light reached these areas from above during most of the day's hours. Rainwater collected in basins placed to catch it for later use by residents. Children ran across the stones playing games while adults worked in rooms nearby. The space belonged to everyone who lived there and to no one individually. Olive oil was stored in large vessels kept in cool areas away from heat. The liquid was used for cooking and for lamps that provided light at night. Small amounts were poured into bowls or lamps as needed throughout each day. The level in storage containers dropped gradually and was replenished when supplies arrived. Oil was valuable and used carefully to avoid waste in most households. Midday brought heat that changed how people moved through their tasks and routines. Work slowed in pace as temperatures rose to levels that made exertion uncomfortable. Shade was sought under awnings or inside buildings with walls thick enough to block warmth. The streets became quieter as fewer people moved through them during these hours. Activities continued but at a rhythm adjusted to accommodate the conditions of the day. Meals were eaten when hunger made it necessary to stop other activities briefly. Bread was broken into pieces and shared among those gathered in the same space. Cheese was cut with knives and placed on wooden boards or directly into hands. Olives were eaten one at a time from bowls passed between people sitting or standing. Wine was diluted with water and poured into cups used many times before. Conversations during meals were brief and concerned with matters immediately at hand or nearby. Comments were made about the food or the work that had been done. Plans were mentioned for tasks that would be completed later in the day. Complaints were shared about discomfort or minor injuries sustained during morning labor. The exchanges required little energy and ended when eating was finished and work resumed. Pottery dried on shelves in workshops where air moved through open doorways and windows. The clay changed color as moisture left the material over hours of waiting. Pieces were turned occasionally to ensure even drying on all surfaces and edges. Cracks appeared sometimes and those items were set aside as unusable for their purpose. Successful pieces would be fired when enough had accumulated to fill the kiln completely. Fabric was inspected for flaws that had been missed during the weaving process earlier. Threads that had broken were tied or rewoven into the pattern where possible. Uneven sections were noted but usually left as they were unless very noticeable. The cloth was folded and stacked with other completed pieces waiting for buyers. New thread was prepared on spindles for the next section to be started. Leather had dried on forms and was ready to be removed and shaped further. The material was stiff and required soaking again to make it workable by hand. Holes were punched along edges where stitching would join pieces into finished items. Awls were pushed through the leather in lines marked earlier with tools or memory. Thread was pulled tight to close gaps and create shapes that would hold together. Bread cooled after being removed from ovens and placed on surfaces near windows or doors. The crust hardened as the loaves lost heat to the air surrounding them. Some bread was sold immediately to people who came to purchase it regularly. Other loaves were stored for later sale or consumption by the baker's household members. The cycle of baking continued throughout the day in shifts as ovens remained hot. Metal cooled slowly after being shaped and was examined for defects or weaknesses that appeared. Cracks meant the piece would not be useful and the material would be melted again. Successful items were filed or polished to remove rough edges left from forging and hammering. The work was tedious and required attention to avoid injury from sharp metal surfaces. Finished pieces were added to others waiting to be taken to market or delivered. Stone blocks were loaded onto carts when they were finished and ready for transport. Workers lifted the heavy pieces using ropes and wooden poles for leverage and support. Carts creaked under the weight as wheels turned slowly over uneven ground toward construction sites. The stone would be unloaded and placed according to plans remembered or explained by builders. Empty carts returned to the yards where masons continued their work on new blocks. Water was carried throughout the day as it was used for drinking and cooking. The trips to fountains became routine and were completed without much thought or attention. People waited in lines when many others needed water at the same time. Conversations happened while waiting but were not different from those that occurred elsewhere during the day. Containers were filled and the walk back to homes or workshops was made again. Vendors called out to people passing by in voices that blended with other sounds. The words were the same ones used on previous days and would be used tomorrow. Buyers stopped or continued walking depending on their needs and the goods being offered. Items changed hands in exchanges that followed patterns established long before these particular transactions occurred. Money was counted and placed in pouches worn on belts or kept in boxes. Cooking fires were tended to maintain heat at levels needed for preparation of food. Wood was added when flames diminished or when more heat was required for specific tasks. Smoke rose and drifted through rooms and out of buildings in familiar ways. Eyes watered sometimes from the smoke, but this was expected and not remarkable to those present. The discomfort was temporary and not mentioned in most cases during the day. Grain continued to be ground into flour by those assigned to this task regularly. The stone turned in circles as pressure was applied from above with steady force. Flour collected in containers placed beneath the grinding stones to catch it as it fell. The powder was fine or coarse depending on how long the grinding continued before stopping. Flour was used immediately or stored in sealed containers until it was needed for baking. Floors that had been swept in the morning were swept again when they accumulated dust. The same motions were repeated with the same brooms used earlier in the day. Debris was pushed to the same places and removed in the same manner as before. The task was performed without thought as hands and arms moved in practiced patterns. Cleanliness was maintained at a level considered acceptable by those who lived or worked there. Animals rested in shade during the hottest parts of the day when not being used. Oxen stood in places where they had been left by their handlers earlier. Donkeys waited with carts still attached to their harnesses until work resumed later. Flies bothered the animals and were swatted away with tails that moved constantly back and forth. The sounds of animals blended with human voices and the noise of work continuing nearby. Children were called inside or into shade when the heat became too strong for play. They sat quietly or helped with small tasks that did not require much movement or effort. Complaints about boredom were ignored by adults focused on their own work and responsibilities. The children waited until cooler air made it possible to return to their games outside. Time passed slowly during these periods of required stillness and inactivity for the young ones. Neighbors shared information about the availability of goods or services in the area. And used tomorrow by the same people who had drawn it today. Nothing about the fountains or their function changed from one day to the next in any noticeable manner at all. Streets held only darkness and the occasional presence of watchmen making their rounds through the city's various sections and areas. Stones that paved the streets were cold from the night air that had settled over them for many hours already. The streets would remain empty until dawn brought the first people out to begin their daily activities and movements through passages. Emptiness was the temporary state of streets that would fill again with predictable regularity when morning came, as it always did. The stones underfoot would be walked on again by the same feet that had walked on them yesterday and before. Market spaces were dark and quiet with no vendors present and no goods displayed on tables or ground surfaces used. The absence of activity made the spaces seem different from their daytime state of crowding and noise and movement constantly. Morning would transform the empty spaces back into the busy markets that served the city's population daily without fail. The transformation happened each day as vendors arrived and set up their displays in the same locations used repeatedly over time. Empty markets waited for the return of activity that would come with light and the start of another day of trading. Families slept in homes throughout the city in the same patterns of rest that occurred every night without variation observed. Breathing filled rooms with soft sounds that indicated the presence of people resting in positions found comfortable for sleeping through darkness. Children remained still in deep sleep that would continue until morning light or sounds woke them to begin another day. Adults rested less deeply but still slept in the hours before dawn would arrive to signal the start of daily routines. The homes were quiet and would remain so until waking began and movement started once more inside the rooms and spaces. Storage areas for grain remained sealed and undisturbed as they had been left when evening came and access was no longer needed. Containers protected their contents from moisture and from pests that might enter if seals were not properly maintained always. The grain inside would be measured and used tomorrow for the same purposes it had been used today and every day. Storage areas served the simple function of keeping grain safe until it was needed for consumption or for baking into bread. The sealed containers would be opened again when morning came and preparations for the day's meals began as they began daily. Animals continued to rest in their pens and stalls where they had been secured for the night many hours earlier now. Occasional sounds indicated movement or shifting as animals adjusted positions during rest, but activity was minimal throughout the darkness. Morning would bring handlers to feed and water the animals before putting them to work or leading them to pasture areas nearby. The animals waited through the night as they waited every night for the return of routine care and attention given. Their needs would be met tomorrow in the same manner they had been met today and all the days before this one. Courtyards remained empty with no one present in the open spaces that served households during daylight hours of activity and interaction. The stones of the courtyard floors were cold from night air and from the absence of sun that warmed them during daytime. Morning would bring people out into the courtyards to resume daily tasks and conversations that occurred in these shared spaces regularly. The courtyards waited through darkness for the return of life and activity that came with each new day beginning as it always began. Nothing happened in the empty spaces during the hours when darkness kept people inside their homes resting and sleeping quietly. The hours before dawn passed in the same stillness that had been present since darkness settled over the city earlier. No light appeared yet to indicate that morning was approaching from beyond the horizon in the distance somewhere. People remained in sleep undisturbed by any sounds or movements that might have woken them from their rest continuing. The night held its place over everything with no sign that it would release its hold anytime soon now. Time moved forward, but there was no way to perceive its movement in the darkness surrounding all things equally. Dough in bowls had risen to the extent it would rise before baking began in the hours to come. The surface of the mixture was smooth and rounded from the expansion that had occurred during the night's passing. Bakers would return soon to shape the dough into loaves that would be placed in ovens for baking today. The dough waited in its bowls as it waited every night after being prepared and set aside to rise. Nothing would happen to the dough until hands touched it again to continue the process of making bread for sale. Watchmen grew tired from walking their routes repeatedly through the long hours of darkness that had continued since evening. Feet moved along familiar paths without conscious direction as attention wandered during the monotonous duty being performed still. Morning would bring relief when the watch ended and they could return home to rest from the night's work. The routes would be walked again tomorrow night by the same watchman or by others assigned to the same duty. The pattern of watching continued every night regardless of who performed the task or how tired they became during it. Dogs slept deeply in the hours before dawn when the night was darkest and quietest throughout the city's streets. No disturbances occurred to wake them from rest that had settled over them hours before this time now. Morning would bring activity that would rouse the animals from sleep and return them to watchful awareness of their surroundings. The dogs would bark and move about when people emerged, and streets filled with the sounds of daily life resuming. Until then they rested in positions that required no effort to maintain through the remaining darkness ahead still. Fires and kilns had burned lower but continued to provide heat to the clay pieces being transformed inside the chambers. The glow through cracks was dimmer than it had been earlier, but still present in the darkness of workshops empty. The firing was nearing completion as fuel was consumed and temperatures began to drop gradually over time passing now. Morning would bring the opening of kilns and the removal of pieces that had been fired through the night's duration. The process would begin again when new pieces were ready to be placed inside for the next firing cycle. Workshops waited in darkness for the return of workers who would resume tasks paused when evening came yesterday before. All materials and tools remained in the exact positions they had been left when work stopped at day's end then. Dust that had settled during the night covered surfaces with a fine layer that would be disturbed when activity began again. The workshops served no function during the hours when no one was present to use them for their intended purposes. Work would resume when light returned and workers arrived to continue with the tasks that occupied their days regularly always. Leather pieces in water had absorbed as much moisture as they could hold during the hours of soaking overnight here. The material was soft and ready to be worked when it was removed from containers in the morning ahead soon. Workers would shape the leather while it remained pliable before it dried again and became stiff once more over time. The soaking was a necessary step in the process of creating items from leather that would be useful and durable. The same process was repeated whenever leather needed to be shaped for any purpose requiring softness and flexibility temporarily provided. Ovens remained cold with ashes settled in the spaces where fires had burned to heat the chambers for baking yesterday. The stone of the ovens held no warmth after many hours without any source of heat being present inside. Cleaning would remove the ashes before new fires were built to bring the ovens back to the temperatures needed. The ovens would be hot again by mid-morning when baking resumed on schedule as it did every day without fail. Cold ovens were the temporary state between one day's baking and the next day's baking, beginning in the same manner as before. Forges remained dark and cold in workshops where metalworking would resume when morning brought workers back to their labor here. The absence of fire left the spaces feeling empty despite the presence of tools and materials waiting to be used again. Workers would arrive and light fires in the forges to begin heating metal for shaping into needed items and objects. The forges would glow with heat again as they glowed every day when work was being done by those skilled in metalworking. Darkness was temporary and would be replaced by the light of fires burning when the cycle of work began once more. Stone blocks in yards remained in the same positions they had occupied since being placed there after work ended yesterday evening. No movement occurred during the night to change anything about the arrangement or location of stones waiting for transport or further work. Morning would bring workers or carts to move some blocks to building sites where they would be used in construction. The blocks that remained would be worked on further or left to wait for another day's attention and labor applied. Stones did not change during the night and would be found exactly as they had been left when workers returned to the yards. Fountains continued to flow with water moving through the channels that directed it from sources to the openings where it could be drawn. The sound of flowing water was constant and had been constant through all the hours of darkness that had passed already. Water would be drawn again when people woke and needed it for the morning's tasks and preparations for the day beginning. The fountains would serve the same function tomorrow that they served today and had served yesterday without any change in how they operated. Water flowed continuously whether it was being used or not during any particular time of day or night occurring. Streets remained empty with only the watchmen present to walk through the passages between buildings standing on both sides silently. The darkness was complete in areas where no lamps burned in windows or doorways along the routes being walked by those on duty. Morning would fill the streets with people moving between locations for the various purposes that occupied them during daylight hours ahead. The streets existed to be walked on and were fulfilling that purpose even now, with only a few people using them currently. Emptiness was temporary and would end when dawn came and activity resumed, as it resumed every morning without exception observed. Markets remained dark and empty, with no preparation yet begun for the day's trading that would occur when vendors arrived later. The spaces were silent and still, with nothing to indicate the activity that would fill them in a few hours from now. Vendors would arrive and transform the empty spaces into busy markets where goods were displayed and transactions were completed throughout the day. The transformation happened every morning when vendors came and set up their tables and arranged their goods for buyers to see. Empty markets waited for this transformation that would come with the arrival of morning and the people who used these spaces daily. Families continued to sleep in homes throughout the city, with no movement yet to indicate that waking was beginning anywhere present. The deepest sleep occurred during these hours before dawn, when rest had continued longest without interruption from any source at all. Children slept without awareness of time passing or morning approaching from the darkness that surrounded them completely in their rooms. Adults rested in the same manner, though some would wake soon when light began to appear in the sky outside. The homes were quiet and would remain so until the first stirrings of waking began in some households before spreading to others. Grain in storage containers remained undisturbed and would remain so until morning came and people needed to access it for use. The containers were sealed as they had been sealed when last closed after the previous day's use of grain for various purposes. Morning would bring the opening of containers and the measuring of grain for baking and cooking throughout the day ahead coming. The grain waited in darkness inside the sealed vessels that protected it from damage by moisture or pests that might enter otherwise. Storage served the purpose of keeping grain safe until it was needed for the consumption or preparation of food each day. Animals began to stir slightly as the hours advanced toward the time when morning would arrive and routines would resume fully here. The stirring was minimal and did not indicate full waking, but rather the natural progression toward the end of night's rest. Handlers would arrive soon to feed and water the animals before beginning the day's work with them or their care. The animals sensed the approaching change from night to day in ways that were not clear or understood by people. Their stirring was the beginning of the transition from rest to activity that would complete when morning came and light appeared. The first hints of dawn began to appear in the sky, though darkness still covered the city and its streets below. Light was faint and barely visible to those who might have been watching for it to arrive from the east. Most people remained asleep and unaware of the gradual change occurring above them in the sky's color shifting. The transition from night to morning happened slowly over time that could not be measured easily by those observing. Darkness would hold for a while longer before releasing its presence completely to the light coming toward the city now. Bakers were among the first to wake and begin their work in the hours before most others stirred from sleep. Hands reached for dough that had been rising through the night in bowls set aside for this purpose earlier. The dough was shaped into loaves using motions practiced so many times they required no thought or attention to perform. Loaves were placed on paddles and positioned near ovens that would be heated soon for the day's baking to begin. The bakers worked in dim light from lamps as they worked every morning at this same early hour regularly. Watchmen completed their final rounds before the end of their duty period that had lasted through the entire night. Steps were slower now from fatigue accumulated during hours of walking the same routes repeatedly without rest or pause. The approach of dawn meant relief was coming soon when they could return home to sleep through the morning. Other watchmen would take their places tomorrow night to walk the same routes in the same manner as before. The duty continued in cycles of night and day, with different people performing the same tasks over time passing. Dogs began to wake as the faint light of dawn reached the streets where they had been sleeping through darkness. Stretching and yawning preceded movement as the animals roused themselves from rest that had lasted many hours until now. Some dogs wandered into streets to search for food or water before the day's activity began in full around them. The animals moved slowly in the quiet that still held most of the city in its grip temporarily here. Full waking would come when more light arrived and people emerged from homes to begin their daily routines and work. Kills were opened by potters who had arrived early to check the results of firing that had continued through the night. Doors were unsealed carefully and heat escaped into the cool morning air surrounding the workshops where this work occurred. Pieces were examined for cracks or other damage that would make them unusable for their intended purposes in households. Successful pieces were removed and set aside to cool completely before being sold or stored with other completed items. The kiln would be loaded again with new pieces when enough had been prepared to fill the space inside efficiently. Workshops remained quiet, though some workers had begun to arrive and prepare for the day's labor ahead of them. Doors were opened to let in the faint light of dawn that was growing gradually brighter with each moment passing. Tools were checked and materials were arranged in the positions where they would be needed for tasks to be performed. The workers moved slowly in the early morning as their bodies adjusted to waking and the effort required for work. Activity would increase as more light arrived and more workers came to begin their assigned tasks in these familiar spaces. Leather was removed from water where it had been soaking through the night to soften for working today here. The material was placed on surfaces where it could be shaped while it remained pliable from the moisture absorbed during soaking. Workers would begin cutting and stitching when there was enough light to see the work clearly without strain or error. The leather would dry gradually as work progressed and would become stiff again when the shaping was completed fully. The same process was followed each time leather items were made in the workshop for sale or used by others. Ovens were cleaned of ashes by bakers who had arrived to prepare for the day's baking that would begin shortly now. The cold ashes were removed and discarded in areas designated for this purpose outside the baking spaces used daily. Wood was arranged inside the cleaned ovens and fires were started to begin heating the stone chambers to needed temperatures. The warming would take time and baking would not begin until the ovens reached the heat required for proper baking. Fires were tended and fed additional fuel as the heating process continued toward readiness for the loaves waiting to be baked. Forges were prepared for lighting by metal workers who had come to begin their day's work in the shops where they labored. Charcoal was placed in the forge pits and kindling was arranged to start the fires that would heat metal for shaping. Bellows were checked to ensure they functioned properly for directing air into the fires when they burned hot enough. The forges would be lit soon and would glow with heat as metal was worked throughout the day ahead coming. Preparation was necessary before the actual work of metalworking could begin, as it began every morning in these workshops dedicated to this craft. Stone masons arrived at yards where blocks waited to be worked on or loaded for transport to building sites elsewhere. Tools were gathered from storage areas where they had been placed at the end of the previous day's work completed. Some workers began shaping new blocks while others prepared carts for loading stones that were finished and ready for use. The yard filled gradually with the sounds of tools striking stone and voices calling out instructions or comments to others working. Activity increased as more workers arrived and the day's labor began in earnest with light growing stronger from the sky above them. Water was drawn from fountains by the first people who had woken and needed it for morning tasks in their homes. The fountains had been flowing all night and continued to flow as they always did regardless of use or time. Containers were filled and carried back to homes where water would be used for drinking and cooking and washing as needed. The fountains would see more use as the morning progressed and more PLE woke to begin their daily routines requiring water. The flow from fountains was constant and unchanging whether one person or many people drew from them during any period of time. Streets began to fill slowly with people moving between their homes and the places where they worked each day regularly. The sounds of footsteps and voices grew as more people emerged from doorways to begin their journeys through the city. Animals were led through passages pulling carts or carrying loads that would be delivered to various locations during the day. The streets transformed from empty and quiet to busy and filled with activity as morning progressed toward the full light of day. The transformation happened every morning in the same gradual manner observed now occurring here as it always occurred without variation noticed. Markets saw the arrival of first vendors who came to claim their usual spots and set up displays of goods. Tables were arranged and goods were unwrapped from cloths or removed from containers brought for this purpose each day. Some vendors called out to early customers who passed through looking for items needed immediately this morning before crowds arrived. The market spaces filled gradually as more vendors arrived and more buyers came to purchase food and other necessities for their households. The empty spaces of night became the busy markets of day through the arrival of people who used these areas for trading. Families began to wake in homes throughout the city as light entered through windows and doorways left open overnight for air. Children were roused from sleep by parents who had woken earlier to begin preparations for the day ahead for everyone. Faces were washed and clothing was put on in the same manner as every morning when this routine was performed without thought. Morning meals were prepared or gathered from food stored the previous day for consumption now before work began outside the home. The households filled with activity and voices as people prepared to leave for their various destinations and tasks awaiting them. Grain was measured from storage containers by those responsible for preparing food for the day's meals and baking needs present. The containers were opened and the needed amounts were removed using measures that ensured proper quantities for recipes being followed. Grain was poured into bowls or grinding stones depending on what preparation was required for its use in cooking or baking. The containers were sealed again after the grain was removed to protect what remained inside from moisture and pests always threatening. Storage areas were accessed and secured in the same manner every morning when grain was needed for the day's food preparation beginning. Animals were fed and watered by handlers who arrived to care for them before putting them to work for the day. Hay was distributed and water troughs were filled from containers brought from fountains or wells nearby the pens and stalls used. The animals ate and drank as handlers prepared harnesses and other equipment needed for the day's tasks assigned to each animal kept. Some animals would pull carts while others would carry loads on their backs to various locations throughout the city and surrounding areas. The routine of feeding and preparing animals was the same every morning and required little variation in the tasks performed by those responsible. Morning continued to develop as light spread across the city and reached areas that had been in shadow moments before. The sky grew brighter with the progression of dawn moving toward full daylight that would come soon enough now. People moved through streets with purpose as they traveled to workshops and markets and other locations where their presence was needed. The city transitioned from the quiet of early morning to the activity of day beginning in the usual manner observed. Sounds increased as more voices joined those already present in conversations and calls heard throughout the surrounding spaces here. Fires in ovens had heated the stone chambers to temperatures suitable for baking bread from the dough prepared earlier this morning. Loaves were placed inside using the same paddles employed for this task every day without change in method or tool. The bakers worked steadily to fill the ovens with as many loaves as could fit in the available space inside. Baking would continue through the morning as batches were removed and new batches were placed inside the hot ovens maintained. The smell of baking bread spread from the ovens into the surrounding air where it mixed with other smells present. Workers at looms began threading shuttles through patterns that would create fabric over hours of repetitive motion performed here. Hands moved in familiar rhythms that required little attention as the work had been done countless times before this morning. The fabric grew slowly with each pass of the shuttle, adding another row to what had been completed previously in earlier sessions. Breaks were taken when hands tired or when other needs required brief pauses in the work being done currently. The looms would be worked throughout the day until evening came and activity ceased for rest and meals at home. Leather workers cut shapes from the softened material removed from soaking earlier when the morning's work had begun here today. Knives followed lines marked or remembered from previous cutting done on similar pieces made before this particular day now. The shapes would be stitched together after holes were punched along edges where joins would be made with thread and needles. The work progressed at a steady pace as each piece was completed and set aside for the next step coming. Leather items would be finished by evening if the work continued without significant interruption or delay during the day's hours. Bread was removed from ovens when the crusts reached the color indicating proper baking had been achieved through heat applied. The loaves were placed on surfaces to cool before being sold to customers who came to purchase bread for their households. Some bread was set aside for the baker's own family to consume during meals later today or tomorrow as needed. New loaves were placed in the ovens to replace those removed so baking continued without gaps in production throughout the morning. The cycle of baking and removing and baking again would continue as long as dough remained to be shaped and baked. Metal was heated in forges until it glowed with the color that indicated readiness for shaping by hammering on anvils nearby. Hammers struck the hot metal in patterns that created the forms needed for tools or other items being made today. Sparks scattered with each blow and faded quickly in the air surrounding the work areas where this labor occurred regularly. The metal was returned to the forge when it cooled too much for shaping to continue effectively with hammers applied. Heating and hammering alternated in cycles until the desired shape was achieved completely and the piece could cool for finishing work. Stone blocks were loaded onto carts by workers using ropes and wooden poles to lift the heavy pieces from the ground. The blocks were positioned carefully to balance the weight on carts that would be pulled by animals to construction sites elsewhere. Carts moved slowly out of the yards when they were loaded and ready for the journey to their destinations in the city. Empty carts returned later to be loaded again with more blocks waiting to be transported from the yards where masons worked. The movement of loaded and empty carts continued throughout the day as building projects required steady supplies of stone delivered regularly. Water carriers made their trips between fountains and the locations where water was needed for various purposes during the day. Containers were filled and carried repeatedly along routes that had been walked many times before today and would be walked tomorrow. The work was tiring and required strength to manage the weight of full containers over uneven ground and through crowded streets. Spills occurred when containers bumped against obstacles or when footing was lost on loose stones underfoot in passages walked. The carriers continued their work despite the difficulty because water was necessary for households and workshops throughout the city's extent everywhere. Vendors arranged their goods in displays designed to attract attention from buyers passing through the market areas during morning hours. Fruits and vegetables were piled according to type and quality to make selection easier for those who came to purchase. Prices were called out to people walking by who might stop to examine items offered for sale at the stalls present. Transactions occurred when prices were agreed upon and coins were exchanged for goods selected by buyers for their use. The market filled with activity as more vendors arrived and more buyers came to complete their purchasing for the day's needs. Food was prepared in homes by those who had remained after others left for work in different locations around the city. Vegetables were washed and cut into pieces that would cook evenly when placed in pots over fires burning steadily. Pots were filled with water and ingredients that would simmer for hours until meals were ready for consumption by family members. Stirring prevented ingredients from sticking to the bottom of pots and ensured even cooking throughout the mixture being prepared. The preparation of food occupied much of the morning for those responsible for feeding households during the day and evening meals. Grain was ground into flour by those assigned to this task in homes or in shared spaces where grinding stones were located. The stones turned in circles as pressure was applied from above with steady force maintained throughout the grinding process ongoing. Flour collected in containers placed beneath the stones to catch the powder as it was produced from the grain being ground. The task was repetitive and required sustained effort over long periods to produce the amounts of flour needed for baking. Grinding continued until enough flour had been made for the day's baking or until the person performing the task needed to stop for rest. Floors were swept again to remove dust and debris that had accumulated since the previous sweeping done earlier this same morning. Brooms pushed the material toward doorways where it could be swept outside into streets or alleys beyond the interior spaces. The task was performed without much thought as it had been done so many times that the motions were automatic now. Swept floors would collect dust again and require sweeping later in the day or tomorrow morning when the routine began once more. The cycle of sweeping and dust accumulation was constant and unavoidable in homes and workshops throughout the city's buildings everywhere present. Animals pulled carts through streets carrying goods to be delivered or materials to be used in various locations around the city. Handlers walked alongside the animals, guiding them through passages and around obstacles encountered along the routes being followed today. The animals moved at a pace determined by their handlers and by the weight of the loads being pulled behind them currently. Stops were made when deliveries were completed or when animals needed rest from the effort of pulling heavy carts over distance. The work of animals and their handlers continued throughout the day as long as deliveries remained to be made to waiting recipients. Children played in streets and courtyards when they were not occupied with tasks assigned by adults in their households here. Games were simple and used whatever objects could be found nearby or were carried from previous play sessions before. Voices rose in shouts and laughter that added to the sounds of the city during the morning hours when activity was high. Adults called to children occasionally to give them tasks or to warn them away from areas where they might be injured. Play continued in the spaces available until children were called back for meals or given work to help with preparations ongoing. Conversations occurred between neighbors who encountered each other in courtyards or streets during their movements through the day's activities now. Information was shared about prices observed in markets or about events that had occurred recently in the surrounding neighborhoods nearby. Comments were made about the weather or about work that was progressing or proving difficult to complete as expected before. The exchanges were brief and followed familiar patterns that required little effort from those participating in them currently here. People continued to their destinations after conversations ended naturally without formal conclusions or farewells exchanged between the participants involved. Garments were mended by those who had time between other tasks to repair tears or worn areas in clothing used daily. Needles were threaded and stitches were made to close openings or to attach patches over damaged sections of fabric showing wear. The work required good light and careful attention to keep stitches even and properly placed along the repairs being made. Mended garments were returned to use and would be worn until they required mending again or could no longer be repaired usefully. The mending of clothing was necessary to extend the life of garments that took time and resources to produce or purchase. The day progressed through the morning hours toward midday when heat would increase and activity would adjust to accommodate the changing conditions. Work continued in workshops and homes with the same tasks being performed that had been started earlier when light first appeared. Hands moved through familiar motions as tools were used in ways that required little conscious thought from those performing the labor. The rhythm of work was steady and would remain so until breaks were taken for meals or rest from exertion. Time passed in a manner that was marked only by the completion of tasks and the beginning of new ones. Pottery continued to be shaped on wheels that turned as feet or hands pushed them in constant circular motion here. Clay was smoothed and formed into vessels that would hold water or food or other materials when they were finished. The shapes created were the same shapes that had been made many times before by the same hands working now. Finished pieces were set aside to dry before they would be placed in kilns for firing in the coming days. The work would continue until the supply of prepared clay was exhausted or until the potter needed to stop for other reasons. Fabric on looms grew longer as shuttles passed through threads in the patterns established when the weaving began days or weeks before. The work required attention to maintain the pattern correctly, but the motions themselves were automatic from repetition performed over years. Weavers sat in the same positions they occupied every day while working at the looms that belonged to them or to the workshops. Backs ached from the posture maintained for hours without significant movement or change in position during work. The fabric would be completed when it reached the length needed for its intended use or when materials ran out. Leather that had been cut earlier was now being stitched together to form the items that would be sold or used. Needles were pushed through holes punched along edges where pieces joined together in the construction of bags or sandals or other goods. Thread was pulled tight after each stitch to ensure the joins were secure and would not separate with use over time. The work was slow and required care to keep stitches even and properly spaced along the seams being created. Finished items were inspected briefly before being added to others completed and waiting to be taken to market for sale. Bread that had cooled after baking was now being sold to customers who came to the shops where it was made. Loaves were selected and coins were exchanged in transactions that took only moments to complete before customers departed with their purchases. The bakers continued to work at the ovens where new batches were baking to replace the bread that had been sold already. The cycle of baking and selling would continue through the day as long as customers came and dough remained to be baked. Some bread would remain unsold and would be consumed by the baker's household or sold at reduced prices later in the day. Metal pieces were being polished after cooling from the forging process completed earlier in the morning when fires burned hot. Cloths were used to rub surfaces smooth and to create shine on the metal that would make items more appealing. The work removed small imperfections and created the finished appearance expected by those who would purchase the items made here. Polishing required time and patience as each piece needed to be worked thoroughly to achieve the desired result evenly across all surfaces. Finished pieces were set aside with others waiting to be taken to market or delivered to those who had ordered them previously. Stone blocks that had been transported earlier were now being placed in buildings under construction at various sites around the city. Workers positioned the blocks according to plans that guided the construction of walls and other structures being built currently here. The blocks were heavy and required multiple workers to move them into position where they would remain as part of the permanent structure. Mortar was applied between blocks to hold them in place and to create stable walls that would support roofs and upper levels. The work progressed slowly as each block was positioned and secured before the next one was added to the structure. Water continued to be carried from fountains to locations where it was needed throughout the day without pause in the routine. Carriers made their trips repeatedly along the same routes they had walked since morning began many hours ago now. Fatigue increased with each trip as muscles tired from the sustained effort required to carry heavy containers over distance repeatedly. The work would continue until evening came and the need for water diminished as daily tasks were completed in households everywhere. Tomorrow the same carriers would make the same trips along the same routes to supply water needed for another day. Markets remained busy with vendors and buyers engaged in transactions that followed familiar patterns of negotiation and exchange observed daily here. Goods were examined and prices were discussed before agreements were reached and coins changed hands between the parties involved currently. Some vendors had sold most of their goods and were preparing to depart while others still had full displays awaiting buyers. The market would remain active until late in the day when vendors began to pack unsold items for storage or transport back. The space would empty gradually as vendors left and buyers finished their purchasing for the day's needs being met now. Cooking continued in homes where pots simmered over fires that had been burning since morning when preparations began for the day's meals. Vegetables had softened in the liquid and flavors had blended together during the hours of slow cooking applied to the mixture. Stirring was done periodically to prevent sticking and to check the progress of cooking toward the desired consistency and taste expected. Meals would be ready when family members returned from their work and gathered to eat together in the evening hours coming. The food would be served and consumed and the pots would be cleaned for use again tomorrow when the process repeated. Flour that had been ground earlier was now being used to make dough for baking bread in OV.